Blue lights flashed through the quiet suburban night, glinting off the polished hood of a sleek black Mercedes. For Officer Marcus Webb, this was no ordinary traffic stop. This was a hunt. He saw the expensive suit. He saw the calm demeanor. He saw the dark skin of the driver. And he made a calculation that would cost him his badge, his freedom, and $28 million. He thought he was pinning a felony on some random thug. He had no idea he was planting evidence on the one man in the state who could sign his arrest warrant. Webb drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the tree-lined streets of the upscale Northbrook neighborhood. This was old money territory. Grand colonial homes set back from the road. Perfectly manicured lawns, a silence so thick you could hear a pin drop. Officer Caldwell hated this beat. It was too quiet. He thrived on the chaos of downtown districts where he could throw his authority around without too many questions, but the chief had reassigned him here after a complaint about excessive force, a mere slap on the wrist. He took a sip of his lukewarm coffee and narrowed his eyes as a sleek Mercedes-Benz S-Class glided past, heading toward the gated community of Pinecrest Estates. "Well, well," he muttered under his breath. "What do we have here?" He pulled out behind the luxury sedan without flipping on his lights right away. He paced the car, running the plates registered to a leasing company, common for high-end executives. Or in Caldwell's twisted view, high-level dealers trying to look legitimate. He peered through the darkness. The driver was a black man alone. That was all he needed. In his mind, the story was already written. A car that expensive in a neighborhood this quiet at that hour simply did not fit. He did not care about probable cause. He cared about the thrill. He flipped the switch and the red and blue lights burst to life, cutting through the shadows of the oak trees. Inside the Mercedes, Judge Thomas Hayes sighed. He was exhausted. He had just finished presiding over a complex racketeering trial at the federal courthouse. A trial that had consumed 3 months of his life. All he wanted was to get home to his wife Claire and a glass of scotch. He checked his speedometer. He was right at the limit. He signaled, pulled over smoothly to the curb, and lowered all 4 windows. A habit born of necessity and survival, even for a man of his stature. Officer Caldwell swaggered up to the window. His hand rested casually yet threateningly on the butt of his service weapon. He did not shine his flashlight into the car. He aimed it straight into Judge Hayes' eyes. "License and registration," he barked, skipping any greeting. "Good evening, officer." Judge Hayes said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. He kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. "May I ask the reason for the stop? I'll ask the questions." Caldwell snapped. "License and registration, now." "My wallet is in my breast pocket. My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them slowly." Caldwell sneered. He hated it when they stayed calm. It felt like defiance. "Just get them!" As Judge Hayes moved, Caldwell leaned in and took a theatrical sniff of the air. There was no smell of anything but new leather and expensive cologne. But he wrinkled his nose as if he had caught the scent of a skunk. "Smell a little weed in here, buddy." He lied. It was his go-to line. The magic words that led him to bypass the Fourth Amendment. Judge Hayes paused, hand halfway to the glove box. He turned his head slowly, eyes locking onto the officer. "I assure you, officer, there is no marijuana in this vehicle. I do not smoke, and I am a federal judge. I don't care if you're the Prince of Zamunda." Caldwell interrupted, chuckling at his own joke. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." Judge Hayes did not argue. He knew the law better than Caldwell ever would. He knew resisting on the side of the road was a losing battle, often a fatal one. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, standing a full head taller than the officer. "Face the car!" Caldwell commanded. "Hands on the hood." Judge Hayes turned his tall frame, bending slightly as he placed his hands on the smooth hood of the Mercedes. The metal was still warm from the evening sun. Caldwell patted him down roughly. He found nothing but a fountain pen and a phone. Frustrated, he spun him around. Wait here, don't move. Caldwell moved to the driver's side of the Mercedes. He knew his body camera was on, but he also knew the blind spots. He angled his body, blocking the camera's view of his right hand as he reached into his tactical vest. He pulled out a small clear plastic bag filled with white powder. Cocaine. He had taken it from a low-level bust and never logged it into evidence. He kept it for moments exactly like this. His insurance. He leaned into the car, pretending to search under the driver's seat. With a quick flick of his wrist, he wedged the bag between the center console and the seatbelt buckle. "Gotcha!" he whispered. He stood up, holding the bag aloft in the glare of the flashlight, making sure the body camera caught it clearly. "Now look at this," he shouted, feigning shock. "A federal dealer." "What you said?" Judge Hayes watched from the rear of the car. His face remained impassive, but his stomach tightened. He was not scared. He was filled with a cold, calculating fury. He saw the bag. He knew it was not his. And he realized exactly what was happening. "That is not mine." Judge Hayes said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the voice that commanded courtrooms. "And you know it. Tell it to the judge." Caldwell smirked, grabbing his handcuffs. "Oh," Judge Hayes said softly as the cold steel clicked around his wrists. "I intend to." The ride to the station was silent. Caldwell tried to goad Judge Hayes into saying something incriminating, playing loud rock music and making snide comments about affirmative action cars. But Judge Hayes sat in the back of the cage like a statue. He was thinking through case law, specifically Brady versus Maryland, Giglio versus United States. He was mentally drafting the subpoena for the officers' disciplinary records. When they arrived at the precinct, Caldwell dragged Judge Hayes out of the car, parading him through the booking area. The station buzzed with the usual activity. Drunks, petty thieves, exhausted officers. Got a big one tonight, boys. Caldwell announced to the room, shoving Judge Hayes toward the booking desk. Possession with intent. Maybe driving under the influence. Found him rolling in a Mercedes S-Class. The booking sergeant, an older man named Owens, looked up from his computer. He adjusted his glasses, squinting at the tall man in the pristine suit. Owens had been on the force for decades. He knew the faces of the regulars. He also knew the faces of the city's elite. He frowned. The man in cuffs looked familiar. Name Caldwell barked at Judge Hayes. "Thomas Hayes." The judge enunciated clearly. Owens stopped typing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He looked at Judge Hayes, then at the TV screen in the corner playing a news recap. The news was covering the racketeering trial that had recently concluded. There was a sketch of the judge on the screen. Owens' blood ran cold. "Caldwell." Owens said, his voice trembling slightly. "Can I see you in the back for a second? Book him first, Sarge. I want this locked in." Caldwell said, pumped with adrenaline. "I want to weigh that powder." "Caldwell. Now." Owens stood up. The room went quiet. It was not often a sergeant barked at a patrol officer like that. Caldwell rolled his eyes, leaving Judge Hayes standing by the counter, handcuffed to the bench rail. He followed Owens into the break room. "What's the problem, Sarge? I caught a guy riding dirty. Open and shut." Owens turned on him, face pale. "Do you know who that is out there?" "Yeah. Thomas Hayes, some rich guy who thinks he's above the law." "That is the Honorable Thomas Hayes." Owens hissed, leaning in close. "He's a United States Federal District Court judge. He was appointed by the president. He just put the entire Salado crime syndicate away. 5 kingpins, federal kingpins, the kind that senators call about." Caldwell's smugness flickered. "Just for a moment. So what?" he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "I found cocaine. I followed protocol." He resisted. Did he? Owens interrupted. "Did he actually resist? Because I watched the body camera footage from the dispatch log. I saw that traffic stop. I saw you plant that bag." The words hung in the air between them. Caldwell's face went from red to white in seconds. "You angled your body. Owens continued, "You reached into your vest. I saw you wedge that bag between the center console and the seatbelt buckle. Professional grade move. You've done this before, haven't you?" Caldwell said nothing. "I've booked people you brought in," Owens said quietly. 14 times before, 14 times I've had that feeling. That something felt off. But this time you picked the wrong person." Owens walked out of the break room and immediately contacted Chief Patricia Morrison. Morrison arrived at the precinct within 30 minutes. She was stern old school with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in law enforcement. Morrison had known about Caldwell's history. She'd been trying for years to find the smoking gun to justify removing his badge. She watched the body camera footage 3 times, once through, once with the volume off to focus on movements, and once more with Owens pointing out the exact moments. The moments when Caldwell angled away from the camera, when he reached into his vest, when he stood up holding the bag. The evidence was definitive, impossible to argue, impossible to dismiss. "This isn't one officer," Morrison said quietly to Owens. "If he's done this to a federal judge, how many others?" She immediately ordered an audit of Caldwell's cases over the past 12 years. She pulled the files of all his arrests that had resulted in drug possession charges. She began reviewing body camera footage from every single stop. The pattern emerged almost immediately: 23 stops over 12 years, 16 of them involving black defendants. Suspiciously found contraband in nearly every case. 0 convictions overturned because none of the victims had the resources to challenge the evidence. Judge Hayes was released from custody within 3 hours. No charges were filed. No formal arrest was recorded. But the investigation had already begun in earnest. The FBI was notified within 24 hours. A federal judge being arrested on planted evidence was a matter of constitutional significance. A federal crime. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The investigation became federal immediately. Forensic examination of Caldwell's tactical vest revealed particulate cocaine residue that matched the bag he had planted on Hayes. Body camera footage was enhanced and analyzed frame by frame. Caldwell's angling away from the camera was captured with absolute clarity. His hand movement reaching into the vest, his body language showing intention. Investigators began contacting the 23 prior victims whose cases Caldwell had worked. They discovered something that made the entire department shudder. A second victim, Maria Santos, a young black woman, stopped for a broken taillight that did not exist. Cocaine was found. She spent 3 months in jail before the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. She lost her job. Her family was disrupted. She still had nightmares about the arrest. A third victim, Deshaun Morrison, a teenager, pulled over for a rolling stop. Marijuana was discovered. He spent 18 months in juvenile detention. He still refused to drive. Anxiety attacks. The trauma had shaped his entire adolescence. Victim after victim, story after story, each one describing the same pattern. Caldwell's hand on his weapon, Caldwell's aggressive stance, Caldwell's fabricated probable cause, and then the miraculous discovery of contraband that the defendants insisted they had never possessed. Sergeant Owens testified to the FBI that Caldwell had bragged about establishing the baseline with certain drivers, about teaching lessons about respect for authority, about knowing exactly which neighborhoods contained the easiest targets and the least legal pushback. The scope of the investigation expanded exponentially. It was no longer about one corrupt officer. It was about institutional failure, oversight failure, the way corruption had been enabled by inaction and protected by procedure. Judge Hayes met with federal prosecutors and FBI investigators. He provided a detailed timeline of the stop. He explained the body camera evidence. He spoke about the constitutional implications of what Caldwell had done. But Hayes did something else that surprised everyone. He declined to settle quietly, despite having the resources to disappear into his life. to let the legal system process Caldwell without public attention. Hayes chose a different path. He contacted the federal prosecutor and said 3 words that changed everything. "Make it public!" His wife Elena sat beside him during the meeting with prosecutors. She was steady, angry, resolved. Hayes had explained to her what had happened, and Elena understood immediately that her husband had a choice to make. He could pursue this privately, in the shadows of the legal system, or he could use his position and his platform to expose what had been hidden. Judge Hayes chose exposure. The news leaked within days. Federal judge arrested on planted evidence. Officer under investigation. The story exploded across national media. A federal judge. Planted drugs. Body camera evidence. It was a narrative that resonated with deep fears about corruption and the abuse of authority. Civil rights organizations issued statements. The NAACP announced the Hayes case as a symbol of institutional racism in law enforcement. National news outlets began investigating Caldwell's history. The 23 prior victims suddenly had a voice. Their stories were told. Their trauma was validated. Caldwell's union attorney issued a statement. Officer Caldwell maintains his innocence and will defend vigorously against these charges, but Caldwell knew there was no defense. The body camera evidence was definitive. His prior behavior was a pattern. The only question now was how many years he would spend in federal prison. Federal prosecutors moved with decisive speed. The charges were comprehensive and devastating. Evidence planting, a felony, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony, false imprisonment, a felony, conspiracy to violate civil rights, a federal felony. Based on the pattern of conduct over 12 years, RICO statutes were being considered. Potential sentence, 25 to 35 years in federal prison. Caldwell was arrested at his home on a Wednesday morning. Federal marshals, handcuffs, the same ritual of humiliation that he had inflicted on 23 innocent people, experienced from the other side. His bail hearing was set for the following week. The judge, not Hayes, but a different judge assigned to avoid any appearance of bias, listened to the prosecution's argument. Caldwell posed a flight risk. Caldwell had access to institutional knowledge about the judicial system. Caldwell had already demonstrated a willingness to abuse authority. Bail was set at $250,000. Caldwell could not afford it. He remained in custody. He was processed like every other inmate. Strip searched, issued a jumpsuit, assigned a holding cell. The officer who processed him was someone Caldwell had worked with for years. The officer would not meet his eyes. Caldwell sat in his holding cell and confronted a reality that seemed impossible. There was no way out. The union attorney had made that clear during their first meeting. The body camera evidence was definitive. The pattern of prior conduct was documented. The victims were willing to testify. The prosecutor had offered a plea deal, a guilty plea on all counts, an 18-year sentence instead of 25 to 35 years. Caldwell's attorney advised accepting the deal. Trials were unpredictable. Juries were emotional. Better to take the guaranteed sentence than risk a longer one. But accepting the plea meant admitting what he had done. It meant acknowledging that the foundation of his career, the authority, the badge, the power to stop and search and control, had been built on lies and violence and the exploitation of people he had decided were beneath him. The media coverage was relentless. Journalists began investigating Caldwell's history. They interviewed his ex-partners. They spoke to his ex-wife. They tracked down some of his prior victims and gave them a platform to speak about the trauma they had endured. A woman named Janet spoke on camera about her son. She had been stopped by Caldwell 7 years ago. Cocaine was found in her car. She went to jail. Her son went to foster care. By the time her conviction was overturned on appeal, her son had been with the foster family for 2 years. The legal process of re-establishing custody took another 18 months. By then, the damage was done. The national civil rights organizations intensified their involvement. The ACLU filed amicus briefs. The NAACP held press conferences. The message was clear. This was not just about one corrupt officer. This was about institutional failure and the need for accountability and reform. The police department faced federal scrutiny. The chief was called before the city council. Questions were asked about training, about supervision, about accountability. How had Caldwell been allowed to conduct 23 suspicious stops? How had the pattern not been detected? What was wrong with the department's oversight? Caldwell's former partner officer Santiago came forward to the FBI. Santiago described Caldwell's techniques in detail. He described the racist comments Caldwell made during their shifts. He described how Caldwell had bragged about knowing the blind spots on the body cameras. He described an institutional culture where the union protected its own no matter what they had done. Caldwell realized sitting in his cell that no one was coming to help him. Everyone was running away from him. The union attorney was preparing to negotiate the best plea deal possible. The department was distancing itself from him. His former colleagues were pretending they had never worked with him. The consequences began to pile up. Caldwell's home address was leaked by an activist group. His family received harassment. His wife filed for divorce. His children refused to see him. A social worker would need to facilitate any future contact. Caldwell's pension was under review for forfeiture. The federal government was seeking to strip him of all retirement benefits. The civil rights violations he had committed meant that he would lose not just his freedom but also the financial security he had been building for 12 years. The prosecutor added additional charges based on Santiago's testimony. Pattern of misconduct, conspiracy, potential supervisory knowledge by the department itself. Chief Morrison testified before the city council that Caldwell's actions represented a fundamental failure in training, supervision, and accountability. She announced that the department was implementing new protocols, mandatory body camera activation throughout every stop, regular audits of police stop data, investigation of any patterns suggesting racial targeting. Judge Hayes announced his plan to use the civil settlement proceeds, which the city was already beginning to negotiate, to establish a legal defense center. The Marcus Hayes Center for Legal Justice Against Police Abuse. It would provide free legal defense to citizens victimized by police misconduct. It would challenge corruption wherever it appeared. The prosecutor formally offered the plea deal to Caldwell's attorney. 18 years instead of 25 to 35. It was time to decide. Caldwell's attorney was clear. Take the deal. The evidence against him was overwhelming. A trial would only give the prosecution a platform to present the full scope of his corruption to a jury that would almost certainly convict him. An 18-year sentence was the best outcome possible. Caldwell accepted the deal. He would plead guilty. He would accept 18 years. The federal courthouse was packed for the sentencing hearing. The gallery was filled with journalists, civil rights activists, and representatives from major news organizations. Security was heightened. There were 6 cameras set up in the back of the courtroom. All 9 council members were present. It was not just a sentencing hearing. It was a moment of institutional accountability. Judge Patricia Hammond presided. She was a woman known for her rigorous interpretation of the Constitution and her complete impatience with abuse of authority. She had been carefully selected precisely because no one could accuse her of bias. She had no connection to Hayes. She had no history with Caldwell's department. Caldwell was escorted into the courtroom by federal marshals. He was wearing an orange prison jumpsuit now. His wrists and ankles were shackled. The man who had spent 12 years projecting authority and power was now visibly stripped of both. The prosecutor presented the evidence. Body camera footage played on screens. The jury saw Caldwell reaching into his vest. They saw him placing the bag in the Mercedes. They saw him standing up with exaggerated shock and fake discovery. The prosecutor called witnesses. The first was Maria Santos. She described the stop, the fear, the arrest, the months in jail, the loss of her job, the ongoing trauma. Her voice shook as she spoke, but she did not break. She looked directly at Caldwell as she testified about the impact his lie had had on her life. The second victim was Deshaun Morrison. He was no longer a teenager, he was 22 now, but his eyes still held the memory of the trauma. He testified about the panic attacks, the refusal to drive, the way the arrest had shaped his life trajectory, the opportunities he had lost because of those 18 months in juvenile detention for a crime he did not commit. Janet testified about her son. She spoke about the foster care system. She spoke about the years of work required to rebuild her family. She spoke about her son's anger at the mother who had abandoned him. Even though she had been imprisoned for something she did not do, one by one victims testified. Their stories accumulated. The weight of what Caldwell had done became undeniable. This was not one mistake. This was a pattern of violence and abuse and exploitation that had stretched across 12 years and touched dozens of lives. Judge Hayes testified. His voice was calm, professional. He described the stop. He described the immediate recognition of the planted evidence. He described the constitutional violation he had witnessed in real time. "I have spent 34 years in law," Hayes said, speaking directly to Judge Hammond. "I have presided over criminal trials. I have studied constitutional law. I understand the protections we are supposed to have under the Fourth Amendment. And I watched Officer Caldwell violate those protections with complete confidence that he would never face accountability." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Officer Caldwell expected no resistance because he had never faced accountability. He had established a pattern of predation based on my appearance, my vehicle, my race. That pattern was enabled by a system that failed to hold him accountable. But it was also enabled by his confidence that his authority would always override the rights of the people he targeted. That confidence was misplaced. Chief Morrison testified next. She described the audit of Caldwell's cases. She described the pattern that emerged. She described the failure of her department to detect and respond to what should have been obvious indicators of misconduct. This officer was not acting in a vacuum, Morrison said. This officer was operating within an environment that allowed him to believe he could commit these crimes without consequence. That is a failure of leadership. That is a failure of the department, and it is a failure of the system that protected him. I take responsibility for that failure. Caldwell's attorney attempted mitigation. Officer Caldwell maintains that he did not intentionally plant evidence. He may have become confused about the source of the contraband. This was an isolated incident, not part of a pattern. Judge Hammond's expression did not change, but something in the air of the courtroom shifted. "That defense fails on every count," Judge Hammond said quietly. "Body camera footage shows intentional angling away from the camera. Forensic evidence shows deliberate placement of contraband. Officer Caldwell's prior behavior shows a pattern of identical conduct. I am not persuaded by arguments of confusion or isolated incidents. The evidence overwhelmingly supports deliberate misconduct." Judge Hammond prepared to deliver the sentence. The courtroom was absolutely silent. "Officer Marcus Caldwell," Hammond began, "you abused the authority entrusted to you. You targeted citizens based on race. You fabricated evidence. You destroyed lives. The law will hold you accountable." She paused, and in that pause, Caldwell seemed to shrink further into his chair. "On the charge of evidence planting, I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison. On the charge of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison. On the charge of false imprisonment, I sentence you to 5 years in federal prison. These sentences will run consecutively. You are sentenced to 24 years in federal prison." The courtroom exhaled. 24 years, not the 18-year plea deal, not the 25 to 35 that the prosecution had sought, but substantially more than Caldwell had anticipated. Additionally, Hammond continued, "You are stripped of all pension benefits. You are ordered to pay restitution to each of the victims of your misconduct. The court will determine the amount. You will be released no earlier than your full sentence is served. No parole eligibility until you have served at least 20 years. Hammond looked directly at Caldwell. "You thought your authority was absolute? You thought your badge meant you were above the law. You were wrong. Justice may move slowly, but it moves with the weight of the Constitution behind it. You will spend the next 24 years understanding that weight." Caldwell was escorted from the courtroom by federal marshals. The gallery erupted in quiet applause. Not celebration, not triumph, just recognition that justice had been served. Judge Hayes sat in the gallery with Elena beside him. He watched Caldwell being removed from the courtroom. There was no satisfaction in his expression. There was no hatred. Just the grimness of a man who had done what was necessary. The media surrounded Hayes as he exited the courthouse. He stepped up to a microphone. "Justice has been served," Hayes said, his voice steady and measured. "But the system that enabled this to happen for 12 years must change." This officer did not act in isolation. He was protected by a system that looked away from complaints. He was protected by a union that prioritized the officer over the victim. He was protected by an institution that failed to hold him accountable. We must do better. We must demand better. And we must make sure that this never happens to anyone else. 18 months after Caldwell's sentencing, the Marcus Hayes Center for Legal Justice Against Police Abuse held its opening gala. The building was in Northbrook, deliberately chosen because that was where the violation had occurred, and Hayes wanted to reclaim that space. The center's mission was clear: provide free legal defense to citizens victimized by police misconduct, challenge corruption wherever it appeared, advocate for policy reform, build a system where victims could be heard and where authority would face accountability. Federal district court judges attended the opening. Civil rights leaders, the NAACP, the ACLU, representatives from law enforcement agencies that had committed to reform, journalists who had helped expose Caldwell's corruption. Hayes stood in the center's main office looking at a plaque on the wall. It bore his name. Beneath the name was a simple inscription: dedicated to the pursuit of justice against those who abuse their power. The city council had implemented comprehensive reforms, mandatory body camera activation throughout every traffic stop, footage public within 72 hours, racial profiling data tracked and reported monthly, civilian review board established with investigative authority. Annual bias training required for all officers. In the first year of the center's operation, 47 cases were accepted. 23 prior convictions were overturned. 12 civil rights lawsuits were filed against police departments across the region. 8 policy reforms were enacted in 3 counties. The center became a model that was replicated in other cities. The Hayes Center, the symbol of what was possible when victims were empowered and corruption was exposed. 1 year after the center opened, a young black teenager named Marcus, 17 years old, wearing a hoodie, driving a beat-up Honda, rolled through a stop sign in Northbrook. It was a minor infraction, just a rolling stop at an empty intersection. Officer Rodriguez, who had been sitting in a speed trap nearby, saw the violation. He flipped on his lights. The Honda pulled over. Marcus's hands immediately went to the steering wheel. His hands were shaking. Rodriguez walked up to the window. "License and registration," he said, his tone professional and neutral. Marcus handed over his license. "You know you rolled that stop sign, kid," Rodriguez asked, shining his flashlight into the back seat. "You got anything in here I should know about guns, drugs?" "No, sir," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "Just my gym bag." Rodriguez's hand drifted toward the door handle. It was a pressure tactic. He did not have probable cause. He was fishing. He was looking for an opportunity. But Marcus had been prepared for this moment. His parents had taught him. His school had taught him. The community had taught him. He reached into his sun visor and pulled out a small laminated card. It was black with gold lettering. He held it out the window. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice trembling but firm, "I do not consent to any searches. If you have further questions, please contact my counsel at the Marcus Hayes Center for Legal Justice. Their 24-hour hotline is on this card." Rodriguez froze. He looked at the card. He read the name. The name was radioactive. Every cop in the state knew what happened if he tangled with that center. They knew that within minutes, a lawyer would be on the scene with a camera crew. They knew that if they stepped 1 inch out of line, they would be the next headline. Rodriguez looked at Marcus. He looked at the card. He looked at his body camera. He sighed, stepping back. "All right," he said, his tone shifting instantly from aggressive to professional. "Just come to a complete stop next time. Okay?" Rodriguez said to Marcus, handing back the card. "Drive safe." "Thank you, officer," Marcus said, his voice steady now. He had survived what others had not. He had been protected by a system that had been rebuilt on the foundation of Hayes' refusal to stay silent. Marcus drove away safe and unharmed. The ghost of Hayes' violation had been transformed into a shield for the innocent. Judge Hayes, now retired from the bench, sat in his study surrounded by books and the accumulated wisdom of 34 years in law. His hair was completely white now. On his desk sat a framed photograph from the center's opening gala. He was shaking hands with Jack Morrison, the center's lead attorney. The sign for the center glowed in the background. He picked up a glass of scotch and swirled the amber liquid slowly. He thought about Marcus Caldwell sitting in a federal prison cell. Caldwell would spend at least 20 more years there. His name was now synonymous with corruption and abuse. His legacy was not one of authority, but of cautionary tale. Hayes did not hate Caldwell anymore. Hate required energy. Caldwell was simply a lesson, a chapter in a book that was still being written. He thought about Maria Santos, who had recently graduated from college using grants provided by the Legal Defense Fund. He thought about Deshaun Morrison, who had become a counselor helping other young people process trauma. He thought about Janet and her son, who had been reunited and were rebuilding their relationship. He thought about the young man named Marcus, protected by a system that now had accountability built into its foundations. Hayes had not resolved the fundamental inequities of the legal system. No single man could do that. But he had changed something. He had exposed corruption. He had empowered victims. He had created an institution that would continue protecting people long after he was gone. He took a sip of the scotch and looked out the window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, an officer might be considering planting evidence. And somewhere out there, a victim might have access to the Hayes Center's resources. The game had changed. Not entirely, not completely, but it had changed. Hayes set his glass down on the desk. "Here is to you, Marcus," he whispered to the empty room. "Here is to you, Officer Caldwell. You finally did your job. You are protecting and serving whether you like it or not." He turned off the lamp. The study went dark. But outside, the city was a little bit brighter. This is the full unvarnished story of how arrogance met its match in absolute integrity. It is a story that reminds us that while the wheels of justice grind slowly, they grind exceedingly fine, especially when you have a federal judge in the driver's seat. Marcus Caldwell tried to weaponize the law against an innocent man. But in the end, he became the very tool that dismantled the culture of corruption he relied on. He lost his freedom. He lost his fortune. He lost even his name, which became synonymous with the very abuse of power he had perpetrated. This story serves as a powerful reminder in the age of information. The truth is watching. And sometimes karma does not just hit back, it builds a legacy on your grave. No matter how powerful someone may seem or how dark the moment feels when injustice comes knocking, integrity and patience will always win in the long run. Marcus Caldwell thought his badge gave him the right to destroy an innocent man's life, simply because of the color of his skin and the car he drove. What he never understood was that the very system he tried to twist could one day turn on him with unstoppable force. Judge Marcus Hayes did not scream. He did not fight back on the roadside. He did not rush for revenge. Instead, he stayed calm, he trusted the truth, and he let the evidence speak when the time was right. His quiet strength reminds us that real power is not loud or aggressive. It is steady, it is intelligent, and it is rooted in doing the right thing even when the world feels stacked against you. This tale proves that justice does not always strike fast, but when it does, it strikes with perfect precision, sometimes even turning your worst mistake into a force for good that helps countless others. It teaches us to never underestimate the quiet power of truth, to hold on to our dignity when others try to strip it away, and to believe that justice, though slow, is still watching and waiting. If this powerful story moved you, touched your soul, or reminded you to stand tall in tough times, drop a comment below and tell us what lesson you will carry with you after hearing how one man's arrogance was turned into lasting good. Which part hit you the hardest? And if you want more real-life stories of courage, justice, and ultimate redemption, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a single story that could change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and remember, the truth is always watching,